Welcome to the program. We are joined today by Raul Lomeli. He is the co-founder and executive chairman of Welcome Tech, a venture-funded mobile tech platform helping immigrant communities connect information, products, and services. Lomeli has led the development of a digital Ellis Island with a mission to empower Spanish-speaking consumers to become better informed, confident, and active participants in U.S. society. Prior to launching Welcome Tech, Lomeli was vice president of diverse growth segments at Wells Fargo. He has also served as president of the Latino Education Achievement Project, as press and public affairs attaché for the Consulate General of Mexico in Los Angeles, and as a research director for the program on Mexico at UCLA. Lomeli is an avid writer and has co-authored a book on financial aid for higher education, over 50 published news articles, and the lead author of 18 booklets on financial services, the healthcare system, and higher education, with over 9 million copies distributed across the United States. He's also served on various boards, including currently serving as chair of Emerging Markets Development Corporation, executive board member of ProfMex, and immediate past chair of the board of directors at the Latino Legal Voice for Civil Rights in America. He is, among all of the accolades, among all of the formal elements of his professional background, it's very important as we begin this conversation for you to know that he's also the child of migrant farm workers. And that is so much of what inspired his work. And I will give Raul in a moment here a chance to introduce himself to you so that you can hear from his own perspective. But as we kick off this conversation, I think it's important to know that this highly accomplished individual started in a humble beginning with a family that had to figure out their way in American society, like so many are today. And so while this is a conversation about immigration and the journey of immigrants in the United States, it's not just an American story. What we're going to talk about could be replicated in many countries around the world. But why I thought this angle to take was important, because we've covered the topic of migration a lot this season, but we haven't really covered it from the perspective of the business community and from leaders who are trying to build businesses and nonprofits to help. You know, anywhere there's a problem, somebody has a solution. And anywhere that there are people looking for work, there are those who wish to hire them. And anywhere there are people coming into a new society trying to figure out their way, there's a need. And the business community and entrepreneurs are usually pretty good about finding a way to match the needs of people with a solution and coming up with those solutions. And it's always good to talk to people who are on the forefront of trying to develop those. So Raul fits that definition. I think you'll find this conversation informative, but also you may learn something about the history of immigration issues in the United States. We very intentionally pull back and pull out of the political conversation and to more of a historical and educational conversation. We walk through a little bit of the history of where migration from Latin America has fit into the U.S. experience in the past, how it has evolved, how various government administrations and cultural impulses have changed that relationship. And then we talk about the current day and a little bit about the future. So it's a comprehensive conversation, and Raul's a good sport and gave us a little bit of extra time to not only talk about all of those things, but also even a little bit at the very end on his experience as an entrepreneur and where he thinks the business community has a role in helping both businesses and the immigrant population in the United States. So it is my honor to present to you this conversation with Raul Lomeli. Raul, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Brian.
Would love to give you a chance to introduce yourself to our audience. I've given a bit of a bio leading into this, but no one can introduce themselves like themselves. So please, for the benefit of our global audience.
Well, thank you, Brian. I always like to say that I got the lottery by being born in the harvest season. I'm a child of migrant farm workers, and my younger brother and myself were born in the month of May and August, which meant we were born in the U.S. side. For those like my older brothers who were born in the month of March, that meant they were born on the other side of the border in Mexico, and that has made all the difference, the only difference really. So when we think about that lottery of where you're born, many times we don't get a choice, but there's benefits and there's privilege that come from being able to born in the U.S. I grew up in Mexico, and that's why you can hear my accent. I get that every time I come into the U.S. They look at my U.S. passport and they go, wait, you were born in the U.S., but you have an accent, which I always like to say I have an accent when I speak, not when I think. And that usually gets me along the way to go and pick up my luggage from the baggage claim and into the country. So bottom line, I'm privileged to have been born in the United States, and therefore my responsibility is to provide access to a large and vibrant community of immigrants in the US so that they can become better informed, confident, and active participants in their new home country, in this case, in the United States.
So tell us a little bit about your business. You are in the business of helping people and helping immigrants in particular in the United States. Share a little bit of the origin of your organization and what you're actively doing to support people today.
Absolutely. Look, my business partner and I, we've been at this for over 20 years. We started with a very basic premise, which was, look, we are a digital Ellis Island. We're not here to change policy as it relates to immigration, but what we can do is that if someone is in the United States and there are about 12 million undocumented immigrants, and then you have an additional 8 million or so from Latin America that are in the country with permits, with visas, with permanent residency. And what we like to do is to tackle practical issues that in turn help them to better integrate into U.S. society, whether it is healthcare, whether it is financial services, or just as basic as how to navigate U.S. systems. So that's how we started 20 years ago. We have now grown to account for over 4.3 million registered users in our platform, but we continue to keep it at the beginning. Very practical information, very straightforward, so that they can understand how the system in the United States works for someone that is an immigrant, and from there, hopefully, they have a better life.
And what's the name of your platform?
The name of the platform for English speakers is Welcome Tech. Welcome Tech allows us to be able to demonstrate how we use technology to make this process easier. However, our main focus is for that Spanish-speaking immigrant population in the United States. And for them, we are best known in Spanish for SABEResPODER, which means knowledge is power. We do believe that culture transcends language, and therefore, we like to teach them in their own language how U.S. society behaves, works, manages to continue to work, and that way make it a little bit easier for them and for their neighbors.
So for our global audience that might not
Yes.
understand some of the history of U.S. immigration, they may be coming of this issue new, maybe for political reasons or otherwise. You've been at this for quite some time, and you've seen all kinds of changes in U.S. policy towards immigration. Can you walk us through a little bit of the change that you've seen in your lifetime and that sparked your business from where policy was maybe 30 years ago and how you've seen the progression now and what impact that's had on the life of average immigrants coming into the U.S.?
That's a very good question, Brian, and I rarely get it because we seem to always think in our lifetimes, what policies impact us and what has happened. If we go back to the end of the 1800s, there was really no immigration office. The actual Office of Immigration was within the Treasury Department, and that's where Ellis Island came to be. People will come into Ellis Island, they get a quick health checkup, and therefore you pay a small fee or a small fine, and you enter the country, and you're able to start working right away. That changed very quickly after that. Right before World War I, it moved to the Department of Labor and Department of Commerce, and it makes sense, right? An immigrant comes in, they can go to the Department of Commerce, they can go to the Department of Labor, they get their visa, they get their permanent residency, they get naturalization, they move on. But then after World War II, it moved to the Department of Justice. And once it moved to the Department of Justice, now the issue of immigration for the first time is an issue of legality. And we go back and forth between the 40s all the way to the 80s. Actually, 1986 was the last time that there was a comprehensive immigration bill passed under the Reagan administration to provide support to what then was considered a very large undocumented population, focused on the agricultural undocumented population, but there hasn't been anything like it since the mid 80s. Now, 2001 happens, 9/11 happens, and now it's moved from the Department of Justice under the Homeland Security. So now it's no longer, are you here legally? Now the question is, are you here to harm our country? So it has become far more difficult to be able to establish a process. And obviously, you just had an incredible show with Dr. Canizales talking about, young children, unaccompanied minors coming into the country looking for asylum. So now it's becoming more and more challenging, right? So we have, when you think in the United States, we currently have about 45 million foreign-born immigrants in the United States. Out of those 1 in 4 of those 45 million are undocumented. Out of the 45 million, we have 20 million that stem from Latin America. And what is something that most people don't understand, out of the 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants, about 1 million are from Canada and Europe. But we tend to spend a lot less time in that million, but it's pretty much about 8% of the total undocumented population. And we really focus more on what's happening right now in our southern border.
So once upon a time in the U.S., the movement across the southern border was so routine so as to almost not be noticed. And, I think you talk about this a little bit, that, if you had one time of the year, there was a larger population in southern United States, western United States, agricultural states, and then the winter months come, agricultural work dries up, and the population migrates back home effectively. And both sides seem to benefit from this. The U.S. got the benefit of the extra labor force. Mm-hmm. The migrant population that couldn't find similar work at similar wages in Mexico or other countries around Latin America, had the benefit of that. At what point did that symbiotic relationship begin to break down, where the U.S. side started to see it as a threat instead of a benefit?
Yes, look, it's an ever-going debate that has been vastly politicized. Both sides seem to feel very comfortable with the status quo rather than coming together and finding a solution. After the reform that took place during the Reagan administration in the mid-'80s, it has been ongoing whether the United States should again go through an amnesty program. Amnesty seems to be like a horrible word to be used. But as things got more difficult for that free flow of labor, what happens then is that individuals that manage to come into the United States, unable to go back, just like you mentioned, to follow the harvest seasons, now instead they ask for their families to join them, right? And by asking for that, understanding that they may not be able to go back to their home country, they make the United States their home without really a process for them to be able to manage and update their undocumented status. So it's been ongoing since the mid-'90s. It really peaked during the early 2000s, and then it's become pretty flat since 2008, with the exception of a spike on unaccompanied minors, and now what we have with a large number of, particularly Haitians and South Americans seeking asylum in the southern border between Mexico and the United States.
So do you think that the business community could have been more helpful in driving a solution, since so much of this was labor driven? I mean, we'll cut to the sort of the present day issues in a moment, but it feels like a lot of what changed this was the economic conversation, that we went from a place where the U.S. business community and agricultural community saw great benefit in bringing in migrant labor that was not necessarily going to be permanently part of the U.S. community. And then that started to change politically. And I don't know that the business community really did much to change it, while it was to their benefit to a large degree. So can you talk a little bit about what the relationship has been between agriculture, business and the government in policy making during this transformation period?
Yes, there's been a gray area where the power of business, the power of entrepreneurship has tried to really fill that gap while government is focused on security and immigration, the startup community, the technology community have really focused how to make sure that these individuals have access to solutions and to programs, but they've never been able to offer a full-fledged of benefits and therefore keeping it very much under the radar. When you think of banking, that's when us as Welcome Tech came to be very early on, 20 years ago. It was all about utilizing what then was the Mexican issued ID within the United States as a primary form of identification for opening a basic bank account. And banks really thrived in doing so. Millions of accounts were open. However, they only opened it for basic savings and basic checking accounts. No access to credit, no access to home mortgage, no access to education on how to manage credits in their home country. So it's been constant, this really dichotomy of wanting to help and really not being able to use it. But it really ends with financial services, because when you look at healthcare, that has never been really an opportunity for an undocumented worker to actually pay into the system to even have access to health insurance. That is changing slightly in some states in the United States, but at the federal level, it remains in limbo. And that's why what we try to do is just educate our constituency so they understand what they can have access to, and to try to be, better, citizens, better residents in their communities.
Now, as you look to the issues that face migrants who are coming into the U.S. for labor reasons versus those who are coming for refugee and asylum reasons, these are obviously people coming from two very different circumstances. So as you think about supporting either arrivals, I'm assuming that the needs are very different depending on why you're coming across to the U.S. Talk to me a little bit about what those challenges are on either the economic side or more of the personal safety side.
Yes. So when someone is here for labor purposes and they're undocumented, the biggest challenge that we find is that they live in what we call mixed status households, which means not all, an undocumented person doesn't usually just marry another undocumented person. It's mixed status households. And the challenge that we face is how can we bring to the table solutions that allow for the entire household to be able to sign up for a savings account, for car insurance, for utility bills, without denigrating or without taking component of that household unable to be able to sign up for those same services. So when someone is accepted in the border to have refugee status, they are welcome into the country, and now they have to wait until they have their day in court, in immigration court. But unfortunately, because of lack of judges, that may be 2, 3, 4 years down the line. But it makes it a bit easier because they do have a reprieve. They can stay in the country while they wait for that court order, and we're able to actually access and provide products and services much easier than to an undocumented population. But really our focus, Brian, is to make sure that we bring dignity to the process. And that's why all products and services that we offer are regardless of whether they have a social security number or not. They can open a bank account, they can access credit, and they can even access health savings programs to be able to help them deal with the new country, particularly as it relates to access to dental care, which is the question that we get the most all the time. It's all about dental hygiene, because usually you don't think of dental as an urgent care, and they wait until suddenly the pain and the inability for them to be able to function in their job, that's when it comes in. And that's why dental services is one of the main areas that we focus on, something that we don't think about it much as society, but that it has so many implications to the well-being of us as a people and as our healthcare. So yes, we take it one day at a time, and we try to identify, because our members are all over the country, in all 50 states, and just identifying what programs we can direct them to so that they can actually gain access to basic care.
What are some of the foundational services that in the first month, maybe the first week of arrival, are critical to getting them off to a good start?
We usually, there's a bit of a time frame where we don't really interact with them because they just arrived. Usually it's 2 to 3 years after they've been in the country when they realize, I'm going to be here for the long term. I need to make sure that I establish a bank account, that I have access to healthcare, that I need to understand how US systems work. So usually when someone is recently arrived, they are within their own communities or with family networks, and that's where they will spend the first 2 years or 3 years. We get to start to see them once they've been in the country 3 to 5 years, and that's where it evolves. We have a free layer at the very top of it where we have conversations one-on-one, mostly via SMS, via text. That seems to work for us very effectively. We have about 2 million engagements per week with our audience, but they're in topics that are, well, very basic, very important. Whether it's, how do I enroll my children in school? Where can I access classes so I can learn English? How can I actually sign up for a basic bank account? Where can I access dental services or basic health savings programs? So those are the types of questions that really, manage 80-90% of the volume of incoming questions into our system.
What are some of the more challenging cultural integrations? You mentioned language. I'm sure that's probably an important element. But are there other, connecting with a local community, connecting with a local church group? What are some of those other cultural pieces that are important to feeling welcomed into a community?
This is not only for the immigrant population, but battling misinformation. So many times we are trying to bring clarity to a process, and there's so much abuse from pseudo businesses that are supposed to be helping them that really take them the wrong way. So for us, the biggest challenge, whether it is in Spanish or even in English, it's really making sure that we demystify so much misinformation that they hear or are exposed, whether it is through social media or even through word of mouth within community, where it makes it more challenging for us to be able to provide specific information that they can actually take and use for the betterment of themselves and their families. Again, this is not something, it's just for our immigrant community. I think that the world, I just came back from Tanzania, and you feel it. The lack of a center for truth and for fact checking continues to lack, and social media conglomerates not doing enough to ensure that they are validating some of the information that is running freely within their systems.
So I don't know if there is a formal engagement between companies like yours and either the U.S. federal government, any departments, or at the state or city level, but are you getting support or partnership from those in more official policy-making positions?
Look, our U.S. government is designed in a way that we are able to collaborate very effectively with municipalities. Once we get to the state level, it begins to be a bit more difficult, because at that point you're talking about policy legislation, right? So it's very vastly different, an immigrant that is requesting for support in the state of California than someone that say that it's in the state of Texas, and I'm in San Antonio, Texas, right? And then at the federal level, it's a bit slower, but obviously we just need to be in the lookout. Some of the things that we try to make sure that the immigrant community understands is, for example, access to being able to drive a car. Do they offer driver's licenses to documented or undocumented, with visa versus with a temporary status? So we just need to make sure that where we are referring them to, it's been validated, by our company to make sure that we're sending them to the right place. I do think for the most part in the country, municipalities and cities are much easier to navigate because they are serving a population with more day-to-day needs. Gets a little bit more complex at the state level, and we have an impasse at the federal level now for a couple of decades.
So the situation has obviously taken on more of a political connotation in recent decades and certainly in recent years. Has it made it harder for you to form those cooperative bonds at the government level, or are you still able to find the good faith actors that are willing to work to solve these challenges and integrate immigrants into communities?
Look, Ryan, we focus on practical solutions on areas that don't really overlap with the discretion that the federal government, the state governments will have. And therefore, we are more of allies, and we're happy to collaborate with whether it's federal government, state governments, or municipalities. We really focus on direct-to-consumer support. We like to really be able to understand where they are in their journey, what are their needs and most pressing needs, and then from there, drive them either down the financial empowerment side or down into access to healthcare, which are the two most important ones. And then from there, obviously how to navigate U.S. systems. But we feel that if at some point there was to be another immigration reform, it would obviously make it a lot easier for us to be able to execute on many of the programs. There's many things that they can constantly ask us that we cannot support them. There's plenty of people that would love to be able to go through a process to get a mortgage and buy a home, and depending where you're at, their options may be limited or non-existent. So bottom line is okay, where are you in this process? What is your family nucleus? Who is documented versus undocumented? And then from there, just giving them the information so that they can feel confident that the decisions they're making are founded in facts and not in just ridiculous statements that you find so much. Like, for example, they keep hearing this fact that that undocumented immigrants are voting massively. Well, that's not true. It's been debunked so many times, but those are the type of things that they need the data so that they can actually defend themselves and be part of the conversation rather than just taking it from all sides.
My theory here in the U.S., for the benefit of our local listeners, is part of the reason, and I think a lot of people around the world know, we have some challenges in the U.S. with specific elements of public policy. And it's hard to think of two that are more challenging for the average American citizen who's lived here their whole life to navigate than healthcare and education.
Yes.
So let's take those two for a moment. Healthcare is an extraordinarily complex system to navigate in the U.S. Doesn't matter how long you've been here. Even if you have a decent amount of money, it can still be a real problem. So that's a challenge I think everybody can identify with. Can you talk a little more about what specific challenges? You mentioned dental is an interesting one, which also is confounding to the average American, that we separate our dental care from the rest of our health care as if our teeth are not attached to our heads and our bodies. But what other, like, I talked with Dr. Canizales about mental health care, which is a huge crisis in the U.S.
Massive.
What elements of the healthcare system do you find that immigrants have the most challenge navigating once they make it to the U.S.?
So at the core, it's understanding of the system, right? For example, we spend a lot of time when they just come into our system to educate them on basic differences between the system in the United States, particularly as it relates to healthcare, and the country where they're coming from. It is not unusual in many of the countries in Latin America that when you need healthcare, you go to the hospital, you go to emergency room. Well, that's not the case in the United States. So right off the bat, we need to tell them, look, going to the emergency room must be a life or death threatening situation. What you use it's not life threatening, you go to urgent care. And that alone, we then explain why, because when we tell them, if you go to emergency room and it's not a life threatening situation, now you're costing all taxpayers meaningful resources for something that could have been dealt with for $50 in the urgent care in the corner, right? Getting them comfortable to be able to have a doctor's appointment via the phone, just like you and I are doing right now. We have been able to broker incredible relationships with very credible nationwide telehealth providers, English or Spanish, 365 days a year, 24/7, for them to be able to have that initial consultation without any additional copay. But it takes education. To us, is we educate on why and how a system works, and then they're eager to be able to follow the rules. They're not here to try to break the rules. They're here to try to follow the new patterns, but for that, we need to educate them. We go as far as explain to them where their tax dollars go and why it's important to file their income taxes. We'll be surprised that the majority of undocumented workers that are in the quote-unquote formal economy, because they actually are utilizing a Social Security number from someone else or made up, that they actually are filing their income taxes without any benefits, because they'll never be able to access a pension plan through the Social Security Administration, but they know that that is the way to go about to be able to live within the rules of the system. So to your question, Brian, is we educate them and then we tell them how the system works, and then they feel empowered to be able to make the right decisions because they do want to follow the rules.
So, that's the routine of just where do you go to seek care when your child gets sick or you get sick. But how do you advise on issues like filling prescriptions and helping educate them on that process?
Yes.
And that's a confusing system.
Yes.
Or even when we get to the next level of needing more complex care. So you need specialty care and how to navigate, that form. Talk a little bit about the next layer of healthcare.
Yes. So when we're talking about healthcare, and you hit a very important component, which is prescription medications. For the most part, again, some of the countries that we come from in Latin America, you can actually buy prescribed medications without the prescription, or that prescription can be issued right there at the pharmacy for you. We do explain the difference. We have an array of guides and videos that help them understand the system. And it comes with our program to be able to identify through the app what is the closest pharmacy or what is the best price for each medication, educating them between the difference between a brand name and a generic medication and why generic exists. Things, again, that we take for granted, that it is not just for the immigrant population. I think that when we go out into a general market, we find out that a lot of our families and neighbors don't really understand it either. But you know what? These are resilient individuals that they want to learn and they want to be able to make the right decisions for them and their families. So once we get to the part of more comprehensive Medicare, that's where we kind of run out of options, unless you are in a state like California that now has Medi-Cal for all based on their income. It is quite difficult, and many times they need to make a decision if they have an illness that will require major involvement from the medical field. Many times they have to go back to their countries after having spent here many years trying to wait for the opportunity to regularize their status. But our focus really is more preventive and more entry-level, basic access to health, as well as basic access to financial services.
And education. So this is another topic that, depending on where you live in the United States, another anomaly of our form of our system. Your zip code is a big determinant of the school that your children are going to go to and what kind of experience they're going to have. So as you're advising immigrants who are coming to the U.S. for the first time with children, trying to figure out what the schooling system looks like and what options and choices that they have to navigate, where does that education process begin?
Yes, you're hitting all the topics that we really focus on. We have the K through 12 education system, and especially when you get to high school, we get to educate them that is a bit different from, again, Latin America. In Latin America, you all go through the same classes. There's no someone taking algebra in freshman year and someone else taking calculus in freshman year. No, everyone takes exactly the same level of education. And why we educate them on this? Because they need to understand that there's certain courses that are going to count for college eligibility just to apply, versus some that will only allow them to graduate from high school. We have a system in this country, in the United States, where principals are not really measured as to what is the percentage of their kids being graduating going to college. They get measured as to what percentage of kids actually graduate from high school, right? And all you need to graduate from high school is basic algebra for most states. So, but if you want to go to college, you need 3 years starting with algebra. So that is the academic side, where we talk to them about the importance of the courses that will qualify them to apply. Now, on the financial side, we talk about the free application for federal student aid, which just went through a major revamp. And if one of the parents is undocumented, they cannot submit that form. What we need to do is that you're going to have to go through the process, get your son or daughter into a college, and once you're in, then they will have to walk into the financial aid office and submit that FAFSA directly, so that they can actually come up with the enumerator of how much money they will be able to qualify for aid for the student. So obviously, I'm wrapping everything in a couple of minutes, but what we do like to do is take our time with them. Answer basic questions, providing more and more information so that they can make the right decisions. But education K through 12 and then K through 16 is key, and especially for them to understand what resources are available to their children and how to do it to make sure that they can actually access those resources.
Let's talk about housing for a moment. This is another issue that over most of my lifetime wasn't all that controversial, but there have been plenty of news reports about, generally speaking, housing shortages. Prices in the last number of years have had an impact, and this is a global phenomenon. This is not exclusive to the U.S. So how has your education had to change in light of those topics, and also just the fact that housing continues to be expensive, whether you are in this country by birthright or by any other means?
Yes. Housing, particularly as it relates to cultural attributes, sometimes can be pretty complex topic. It wasn't long ago, a few years ago, that Georgia passed legislation that basically prohibited more than 2 family units coexisting under one apartment. Crazy. And for many of our families, is that it's very normal to have, grandparents, parents, children, right? Uncles, cousins living under one household. So many times, as basic as understanding what legislation is in place, it's important for them to understand that if they're going to be right outside the rules, they need to understand what the risks are. Now, in terms of housing for access to programs, it's very complex, very difficult. Usually, if you're undocumented, it's going to be quite difficult for them to be able to access, subsidized housing of any type. But this immigrant community we serve, for the most part, they are employed. They are actually generating income, and housing tends not to be as big of a challenge as access to health and having access to credit. We do find that people will come together to share a dwelling that it's multi-generational. But outside of that, that's the only thing that we try to inform them when policies, legislation like this pops out, because that could actually create issues for them, especially when it's not their own home and the landlord could actually kick them out under those premises.
And when we talk about labor issues, I think there's a lot of misinformation about how undocumented immigrants can work in the U.S., whether in an entrepreneurial way with their own business, as you said, if you have access to finance or other means, versus being a regular employee. And that's certainly been another topic of controversy in U.S. politics. So when an immigrant comes in, and whether they want to do an entrepreneurial venture or whether they would like to work for an employer, what is the counsel for them? Where do they begin? Where do they start to figure out how they're going to generate income?
Yes, there's a strong entrepreneurial spirit within the immigrant community. Obviously, the immigrants that we have in the United States or in Europe or anywhere you go, Southeast Asia, they're the most driven. They are the risk takers. There's a reason why they chose to leave behind the comforts of their home to seek a better life. So yes, we have a very strong cohort of small business owners or micro small, businesses. And yes, you're absolutely right. For those that are happen to be undocumented, the creation of an LLC can provide the structure for them to be able to thrive with their small business or micro businesses, joining like the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce or the local chamber can provide access to professional development and understanding better, the tax liabilities, responsibilities that come with it, employment, and so forth. But what we do find is that there's this thriving entrepreneurial spirit within the immigrant community for micro businesses that are really generating many jobs. Many times you hear, in many cities, so happy to bring a major employer, 500, 1,000 employees, but very few people talk about the 10,000 micro businesses that are creating 10 times that many employment sources, but they don't get as much fanfare or cheerleading from those in power.
Now, as you think about the future, it's hard to imagine where we are in the United States now, and frankly, the international community where the mood is now, that we will get back to a place of seasonal movements of people because the laws are just not set up that way. But what would be your expectation as we look, regardless of who wins elections and all that, just
Yes.
realistically, where you see the direction of migrants and countries that are seeking labor, but are also, worried about everything we just talked about, their healthcare system, education system, and so forth?
Yes.
You're probably not going to go back to a period of easy movement, 6 months of the year in one place, 6 months in another. But what do you think would be a reasonable new normal that would
Yeah.
work for both the economic interests of countries that are taking in immigrants, as well as the immigrants and their families?
Yes. Yes. Well, that's, I think, the $1 million question, right? Or the $1 billion question, or the $1 trillion
Maybe
question.
the $1 trillion
The
question.
$1 trillion question, right? Because I think that, again, options. There's a segment of we spoke about the 45 million immigrants. Of those 45 million immigrants, 1 in 4 is undocumented, right? So 11 and a half, 12 million are undocumented. The rest are documented, whether they are permanent residents or they're naturalized citizens. The segment that happens to be undocumented, there's a strong component that if they were to be given the option to go back and forth just for seasonal work, they would accept it, right? On the spot, to be able to do it within the structure of the law. There's another group that now have already set roots here with, a husband or wife that are U.S. citizens, that are permanent residents, children that were born in the United States. Those are the individuals that they would like to know where do they line up so they can begin the process for documentation. All in between, we exist not to make policy, not to lobby government to see how they can do it, just to provide those basic practical tools so they can become better informed, confident, active participants in U.S. society. And that has to do with the 5 pillars, right? It's financial services, access to financial services, access to healthcare, understanding the K through 16 system in the United States and where they live, access to technology, which is so important, and lastly, how to navigate U.S. systems. That's what we're focused on. That's what we're going to continue to do. And of course, if we were to be asked, how can we support a process, would be great. I just don't see it right now, Brian. I'm regardless of who wins this next November 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th. I don't know when we're going to know the results. All we can hope for is for more than the presidency. I love to see our legislative branch getting together and coming up with policies that will allow us to integrate them better, easier, so that they can be prosperous members of the new society.
What do you think is the most common misconception of immigrants in the United States?
I think it's that they're here to take away from us, right? That they're not adding to to our economy, that they're freeloaders, that they're, you have all this misinformation that they say, oh, anyone who comes here, they're getting all these subsidies and they can, live in housing paid by the government, that they're getting checks. That's not the case. And when we look at what others, so-called, developed countries, they're struggling with maintaining their growth patterns that capitalist society requires, right? Japan, you go there and it's an aging country that they do not know they're having issues with massive amounts of housing empty, and they have to deal with the situation. In Europe, they have even a bigger challenge because their immigration tends not to be the same Judeo-Christian immigration. It has its challenges. That's why I'm surprised that in the United States they have such a big issue with immigrants that basically, outside of the language, for the most part, is the same culture. American culture is so intertwined with Latin American culture that the fact that they're coming in to take on jobs that the majority, U.S. born society are unwilling to take, I think that we should take this as an opportunity. Yes, it should be done in a better way so that they can come in with documentation. But I think we have created this mess, and I'm hoping that Congress at some point gets to provide us a path. In the meantime, it's up to companies like ours to make sure that we continue to add to the opportunity for these communities to thrive in this country after so much they give to us.
As we wrap the interview, there is a segment of our audience that are entrepreneurs themselves, who are business owners and leaders. You are one. What are some of the lessons that you've learned over all these years leading this business, both from standing up the business and growing it, or maybe something that you wish you'd have told yourself or somebody would have told you when you were getting this whole thing kicked off?
Yes. Well, look, my business partner and I often speak about, if we thought we were going to be doing the same thing 20 years ago, right? When we started 20 years ago, we said, well, at some point there will be immigration reform, and then there will be a plethora of other entities that will be able to come and do the job that we're doing. It's been now 20 years, and it still hasn't happened. I think that as entrepreneurs, we need to continue to take this leadership role and take it very personally, and to make sure that we are the best at what we do. We may not get the valuations that other peer tech companies do, but we never did it for the extra zeros into the valuation. We did it to really make an impact. We don't educate for the sake of education. We educate to change behavior. We like to track and to be able to measure everything that we do, because to just feel good about it, it's not good enough. We need to be able to demonstrate that how many bank accounts have been opened, how many people are accessing healthcare systems, how many children of our members are going to college, because all of that is what creates our American dream. I think the American dream for immigrant populations have evolved to even a better place. For the longest time, the American dream has been so selfish and personalized to one person, what I can do. And when you look at this immigrant population, it's about families, extended families, communities. And yes, I think the American dream is still alive and well, and we need to find a way to really maximize the power that these immigrant communities bring into our country.
For folks who'd like to learn more about your company or about you, what is the best way for them to do so?
I would invite them to come into our webpage, which is welcome.tech, TECH, welcome.tech. They'll be able to see a lot of the things that we do. And if anyone speaks Spanish, then I invite them to go to SABEResPODER.com. That's where we have most of our education and most of our videos and guides and information. But either welcome.tech or SABEResPODER.com we'll give them a little extra of what we've been talking about over the last hour.
Excellent. We will include links to that in the description of this program. Raul, thank you so much for taking time to walk us through all these topics today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I can't believe it's been 45 minutes. So thank you again for some really, really good questions. Appreciate it.
I want to thank Raul again for taking the time to share perspectives, unique perspective with this audience. It's not every day that you find somebody who's the son of migrant farm workers who can offer that perspective, but has also been extremely successful in the United States and been able to develop businesses and charities and nonprofits, and in this case, a technology company that is helping others who have been in the U.S. and are trying to navigate their way as they contribute to the society. So it's a unique perspective. I hope it was valuable to you. We have talked a lot this season about the topic of immigration and migration, and we'll continue to come back to this topic because there are so many facets to it, and it is complex, and there's no easy solutions anywhere in the world. But hearing as many perspectives as we can and understanding the challenges from both a public perspective, from a citizen's perspective, from an immigrant's perspective, from the youth to the business community, it's only by understanding all of these perspectives that we stand a good chance of finding solutions that can work for everybody and that allow us all to live in a more peaceful and prosperous world, but also in a rules-based world. I do think the common thread that has gone through all of my conversations this season with immigration experts and humanitarians and academics and researchers is that the immigration system of the world is broken. Fundamentally, there are three things that every country in the world understands about immigration and migration. Number one is that it's important that we match those who are seeking work with countries that need workers that don't have enough of their own. And this has become a very toxic flashpoint in many parts of the world. But yet, in a country like the United States and in many other countries that are developed and industrialized, the reality is that demographic growth has left a gap in the workforce. There are many more people who are aging out of the workforce than there are aging into it, leaving a gap that needs to be filled by someone, and often that someone is going to be immigrants because there's just not enough people in the country itself to fill the critical and essential roles that are necessary. So that's one element. Number two, there's often been a view that some immigration is helpful even if you didn't have a big gap in your workforce because it's helpful to gather new perspectives. The entrepreneurial energy that often comes from somebody willing to leave their homeland to strike out for a different life and a better life someplace else. It's especially true in a country like the United States that celebrates entrepreneurial endeavors and allows people to take chances and take risks. That immigrant spirit has often reinvigorated entrepreneurial views, and some of the great companies in the United States are founded by first, second, third generation immigrants, often first generation immigrants or the children thereof. And so there is a benefit to that. And then finally, there's a practical reality that we live in a more interconnected world, and there are many people who wish to move for short periods of time, and so they don't intend to become long-term residents of a nation. They are there to contribute for a period of time before they go home to their families and carry out the rest of their lives in the same nations that they came from. None of the things that I just said are our current international immigration policies and systems set up to deal with, let alone the migrant crises that are set off by conflicts, whether they are human-made conflicts like war, whether they are climate-related conflicts, which have human elements underlying them. There is really no good order for that, and we've had a comprehensive interview in this season 2 on the concepts of international migration and asylum seeking. So whether it's dealing with migrant crises that emerge from natural and human disasters, or whether it's the normal flow of people from places where they are seeking work to places that need workers, our entire international system seems to have broken down in its ability to facilitate both the immigration that is wanted and needed, as well as that which needs to be managed for humanitarian reasons. This is not the fault of any one nation. It's really an international challenge. And so as we wrap this episode, I simply put to you as a private citizen, or if you are in a government position, or if you're leading a business, that this issue needs to be elevated higher on the priority list than where it has been today. Because the demographic challenges aren't getting better. The humanitarian crises are getting worse. And if we don't have an international system that can facilitate a workable, thoughtful, and responsible movement of, and humane movement of people, then we are simply going to build a pressure keg that gets worse and worse over time and leaves the entire world poorer and worse off for it. From the nations that can't get workers that they need, to the countries that don't have opportunities for their people, to natural disasters that set off uncontrolled migration patterns that then cause any number of economic and political challenges in the countries upon arrival for those immigrant populations. And so I wish I had a magic wand. I wish I could offer a magic solution, but that's not my role. My role is to facilitate the conversation. And so for those who've asked, why do we spend so much time on the topic of immigration, asylum, migration? It's because I believe it has been underreported. I don't believe there have been enough conversations around it. I think it's been overly simplified. And I do not believe that the thought leaders of the world have really put their minds together to work on a solution that can work for all involved. But I do know that whether it's the United States, whether it's Western European nations, whether it's East Asian countries, whether it's nations like Australia, New Zealand, even nations that we don't think about in the context of migration and immigration, countries like India or South Africa or Brazil or Argentina, the entire world is affected by this issue, and this fundamental lack of an international system to adjudicate the movements of people in a responsible, humane, and thoughtful way is just getting worse over time, and the issue's not going anywhere. So we've offered many perspectives on that this season. I encourage you to go back and listen to some of those conversations that we have had, everything from the asylum rules and how that's set up around the world and how that system has often broken down and is breaking down, to the experiences of young people who have made it to nations like the United States and how they're navigating their new life, to conversations like this that we had today. Either way, I don't think we're spending enough time looking for the solutions. We're spending a little too much time staring at the problem, but it is a serious challenge and a serious problem. And unfortunately, the only real solutions that have been advocated from a policy standpoint have been sort of a close the doors and lift the bridges and shut the gates and hope for the best. But while that may be necessary at times, especially after periods of complete lawlessness, that is not a long-term solution that will work for either the nations that need and seek immigrants, nor the nations that are struggling and are the sources of immigration and migration. So with all that having been said, I encourage you all to continue to engage in this conversation in your communities, and we'll continue to engage that conversation on this podcast. Thank you all for listening. It's been another great conversation with another great guest. We look forward to speaking again soon. If you have not already subscribed to the podcast, I don't know what you're waiting for, but I encourage you to do so. You can find me on any of your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Libsyn, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms. And of course, we're also on YouTube. You can find me at Brian J. Matos Podcast on YouTube. Subscribe there, and you can also get clips of our episodes for those who don't have time to listen to the entire session all at once, or you want to get a sneak preview, or you just want to share with family and friends and give them a sense of what we do on this program. Thank you all very much for spending time with me on this episode. I look forward to talking to you again soon, and until then, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.